What is the difference between South Carolina Gamecocks football and $1? You can get 4 good quarters out of $1. Haha. Another great joke from Mr. Bruce. All right. So the reason I'm making fun of South Carolina this morning is because we're going to be going over something called the Nullification Crisis, in which South Carolina does something really, really dumb. So before we get to that, however, we have to talk about the state of federalism under the Jackson presidency. So remember, federalism is vertical separation of powers. It is the division of power between the federal government and the state governments, right? So the Constitution gives certain powers to the federal government in Articles 1 through 3, and the 10th Amendment reserves powers not expressly given to the federal government to the states. So the idea is, if it's not in the Constitution, then if the power exists, the power to exercise that belongs to the states. All right, so one of Andrew Jackson's biggest problems with the Second Bank of the United States is that it violates, in his eyes, it violates principles of federalism. So he has a big problem with the federal government being able to essentially bully states and bully citizens of the states by refusing to allow the state banks to lend money to them so that they can, expand their farms or buy new land, right? And Andrew Jackson makes this the major issue in his presidential campaign, and he wins. And as we discussed last time, Andrew Jackson saw the Second Bank of the United States as a monster that he had to kill. And when he successfully stopped it from renewing its charter, the bank died when its charter expired. Right, so Andrew Jackson is a big supporter of the idea of states' rights and federalism. Okay. Now, other reasons that Andrew Jackson supports killing the bank is because he thought that the bank was being used as a political tool. Remember, Nicholas Biddle was making deals with a lot of politicians in the Congress to try to get them to renew the bank's charter, and they succeed until Andrew Jackson vetoes it. Right? He saw the bank as a violation of the 10th Amendment, right? Because the Constitution doesn't say anywhere that the federal government has the power to create a national bank and that national bank can lord its power over the states. So the question of the significance of the national bank and Andrew Jackson's perspective on it is not up in the air. However, his perspective on federalism gets a little more complicated with the Nullification Crisis. So if you just looked at the bank war, you would think Andrew Jackson is a big supporter of states' rights. However, when we get to the Nullification Crisis, Andrew Jackson appears to be more of a supporter of federal rights. Now, some historians think that the reason Andrew Jackson moves from being a states' rights supporter to a federal rights supporter with the Nullification Crisis is because the Nullification Crisis occurs while he is president of the United States, right? So he wants to increase federal power while he is actually in office. This is sort of an oversimplification of the reason Andrew Jackson takes the side of the federal government in the Nullification Crisis, but it's good to keep in mind when we're learning about it. Okay, so what is the Nullification Crisis? In the year 1828, Congress passes a tariff, and like a lot of other tariffs, this tariff benefits businesses in the north, and it actually benefits some businesses out west too, but it really hurts a lot of people in the south and in the west. And it's perceived as benefiting New Englanders and kind of hurting the rest of the country. right? So Southerners are especially hurt by this tariff because remember, what do tariffs do? They drive up the price of goods. So Southerners don't like that they have to pay higher prices for goods. And so from their perspective, this is an abuse of the federal government's power, right? They see this as the federal government favoring New York and Massachusetts and Philadelphia and places like that, and hurting the South, hurting farmers, right? So Vice President John C. Calhoun, who is from South Carolina, argues that states have the right of nullification. So what does that mean? This means that states have the right to get rid of federal laws that they think have violated the Constitution. So this is kind of similar to the power of judicial review. Remember, judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to essentially rewrite or eliminate federal laws that they think violate the Constitution. Well, nullification, according to John C. Calhoun, is the power of a state to ignore a federal law. Right? So John C. Calhoun is from South Carolina. He says South Carolina does not have to obey the tariffs. So if traders from England and France want to bring their goods into a port in South Carolina has the right to refuse to allow the federal government to collect the tariff tax. Right? So this would lower prices of goods in South Carolina. The tariff just would not exist in South Carolina. Right? Now, one reason that John C. Calhoun thinks that states have the right of nullification is because he believes that when the United States was formed, it was formed as an agreement between the states. Right? So he thought power belonging to the federal government came from the states. He thought a bunch of states got together and said, okay, we're going to form a country and we're going to give some of our power to the federal government. And if that's the case, then it makes sense that if the federal government does something that one or two or three of the states doesn't like, those states have the right to ignore the federal government, because in that case, states' rights would be more important than federal government power. Not everybody feels this way, though. There's a senator from Massachusetts called Daniel Webster, and Daniel Webster says, wait, that's not true. Right? When the country was formed, it was not formed by a combination of a bunch of states getting together and creating a federal government. The federal government did not get its power from the states. Instead, it got its power from the people of the United States. Right? The Constitution says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Right? He's saying the power of the federal government does not come from the states, it comes from the people. So therefore, the states do not have the right to nullify federal laws because the states didn't give the federal government the power. People did. People can nullify federal laws, but states cannot. Right? And to some people's surprise, Andrew Jackson took Daniel Webster's side on the nullification issue. He rejected the opinion of his vice president. He turned his back on a lot of people from the South and said, you know what, Daniel Webster is right. States do not have the power to nullify federal laws. All right. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, part of the reason that Southerners are so obsessed with the nullification question is not only because they care deeply about the 10th Amendment and federalism, but also because they are worried about the issue of slavery. Slavery is becoming very unpopular in the North. It's illegal in most of the northern states. Abolitionists in the North are becoming very, very popular. Abolitionists in Congress are becoming very popular. And so Southerners are worried that the North could pressure Congress to outlaw slavery, right? Southerners are worried that if enough northern states get together, they can get enough people in Congress to pass a law, to write a bill, and president will sign it into law outlawing slavery. And they want to be able to nullify that law if that law is passed, right? So I already went over Daniel Webster's position. So Jackson agreed with Weber, right? Because he was afraid that the power of nullification goes too far. Jackson does care about states' rights, but he thinks if states have the power of nullification, essentially we're going to go back to a society like they had under the Articles of Confederation, where the federal government would effectively have to get permission from all the states to pass any laws. Right? So Andrew Jackson is worried that nullification is going to kill the power of the federal government, or at least dramatically reduce it. Right? John C. Calhoun opposes Andrew Jackson, which is kind of amazing because presidents and vice presidents are usually on the same team on everything. They usually agree on everything, at least in public. And here, John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson are publicly opposing each other to their face. Right? John C. Calhoun thinks nullification is the only way that southern states are going to be able to protect themselves against overreach by the federal government. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson thinks getting rid of nullification is the only way to preserve the power of the federal government to hold the country together. Right? So Calhoun makes it very clear to Jackson that he would rather protect states' rights than protect the country. And Jackson says he would rather protect the country than protect states' rights. All right. So in 1832, Congress passes a second tariff. And South Carolina responds to this by simply refusing to enforce the tariff and threatening the federal government. It says, federal government, if you come down here into South Carolina and enforce this tariff, we are going to secede from the Union. We're not going to be part of the United States anymore. We're going to leave the country. Now, South Carolina's response to nullification made Andrew Jackson really mad. And he said if South Carolina secedes, this is treason. He tells federal troops in South Carolina to get ready to go to battle or to go to war against South Carolina state troopers and militias if they try to secede. And he also said, I'm going to use tariffs to enforce these militias no matter what South Carolina says. John C. Calhoun takes South Carolina's side, resigns from his position as vice president, goes back to South Carolina, and it looks like there's going to be a big civil war between South Carolina and the United States. However, things resolve themselves peacefully because no other southern states are willing to go as far as South Carolina, as far as threatening to secede, so they don't back up South Carolina. And then Congress acts and actually lowers the tariffs. So the issue is resolved peacefully. South Carolina just kind of gives up and says, you know what, we're not going to try to nullify federal laws anymore. All right, so this is how the nullification crisis comes to an end. Basically, South Carolina, they're playing a game of chicken and South Carolina loses. South Carolina ends up looking really stupid. In Congress lowers the tariffs. Things are resolved peacefully. All right, tomorrow we'll go over the end of the Jackson era.